Faces in the grain. By the time the store's fluorescent tubes warmed up to their familiar hum, Talia Comer had already rinsed her mug with the back hose and wiped it dry with a towel that never quite softened, no matter how long it spent in her sink. The water tasted like wet pennies and last year's leaves. The hose had been her landlord's idea. Use that. The old faucet-esser mess. And the gasket at the spigot whistled when she turned it. She let the stream run over her thumbnail until a clean crescent showed. She did not think about the woods yet. She thought about the shift schedule tacked by a magnet to her fridge and the fact that a ballpoint had bled through Tuesday onto Wednesday like a rainstorm leaking through a roof. Her refrigerator had a hum with two moods. The high one sounded like bees in a jar. The low one sounded like the breath of a sleeping animal that dreamed hard. The hum followed her to the door as she slipped on her jacket and stood a second with her hand on the knob, listening for the sound that had woken her at 4. Not the distant sirens on the highway, not the dog at the Miller place, but something like paper being stroked with a fingernail. In the thin hour before dawn, she had convinced herself it was nothing. The woods say all kinds of things if you nod along. The town of Harrow Elm had one traffic light at Main and Wren. It had been looping yellow in the night since anyone could remember, and you could tell what kind of man someone was by how he handled it. The patient ones idled down and looked for no one. The others hit the gas to hear their own engines. It went red for Talia this morning, though the only other vehicle was a garbage truck asleep across the street, with its forked teeth resting like knuckles on a knee. She didn't mind. She knew the rhythm of all the things here that pretended not to have one. At Finch & Sons, she punched in and set the cash drawers with the deliberate care of a person arranging rocks along a riverbank. A roll of register tape had split, and she guided it back into place. The white ribbon stubborn as a ribbon in a hair that doesn't want it. She loved the gentle tug when it caught and wound, loved more than she let herself say the first clean feed through the mouth, the snip along the serrated edge, the way the paper lay down flat and ready. The barcode scanner opened its eye as she passed, its red line an impatient tongue. The first beep of the day was a loaf of bread. The beep was clear, then fogged for an instant as the compressor in beverage kicked on and the whole row of coolers exhaled. "Morning," said Berman from the back, his voice stretched by the distance and the metal doorframe the way voices do when you were only half sure they were meant for you. She answered with "Morning" and kept wiping the belt. They kept words minimal here before coffee, because once you started it was hard to stop and the day would be gone into stories. The small anomaly arrived while sorting receipts at the end of her first hour. She had forgotten to turn the printer back to regular font after an old woman asked for a big letter copy, and the receipts came out large, clean, absurd. On one, in the blank space between store coupon and total, she noticed something like thread. Long grey lines like wood grain, faint as veins. She rubbed the paper and the surface grew warm and the lines did not change. Receipts pick up all kinds of ghosts, from leaning on a counter still wet from cleaner and from the sweat in palms. She had seen circles from cups, one ring crisp as a map. She turned that one over. The lines vanished, then reappeared where her thumb pressed hardest. She rolled the paper tight and watched the grain follow her thumbprint like a magnet. By mid-morning, people had begun doing what people did, coming in for batteries because the forecast used the word possible with thunder, buying bottled water because the tap had tasted a little metal last week, and once a taste settles in it, never quite leaves. A fisherman with a reddened nose bought a coil of hose and said the river was a measure too low for this time of year. A young mother with twin toddlers wanted to know if Bologna would be safe and did not specify safe from what. When she leaned to sign the card slip, her hand trembled just enough to shake the letters into a pattern. Talia felt, for a second only, a ridiculous urge to lay her own hand on top to steady it. Instead, she said, "If you want me to, I can do that." And the woman nodded gratefully and held her babies to her hip. At noon, the fluorescent buzz receded into ordinary daylight in a way that always made the aisles look briefly like a different town. Talia had a sandwich in the back, cheese and tomato smashed into one corner of the bag, while the compressors clicked awake and dozed again. Her appetite had been narrowing lately without her consent. She could eat half, sometimes 3/4, and then the remaining bite became impossible, like a conversation that had gone too earnest and needed to end before it said the wrong thing. She wrapped the last part and put it back for later and never returned to it. She told herself this with the same tone she used for all her small rationalizations, maybe tomorrow. The rumor came down the produce aisle with a man who folded his bills the long way and put them into a smoking-stained wallet. "You hear about the cursed tree?" Berman, who lived at rumors the way some fish live in shallow waters, called back from the cut fruit fridge. "Don't start." "No, but they're closing the north path," the man insisted. "Posted it, I saw. Something to do with, I don't know. Birds? People hearing things? Lark said his niece saw faces in bark. He swears." "Faces," Berman said, making the word into an apology. "Roots got fingers," the man said, making his own into claws for the benefit of his imagination. "They say it eats souls." He laughed to make his own words go down easier. "Come on," he said to Talia, softer, as if speaking to one person made him braver. "You know the old vale. You live right up against it, right?" "I live by the south break," Talia said. "The oldest trees are north." She wished she hadn't added that last part. The man liked knowing things too much. "Right," he said. "Well, keep your doors shut." He left, and the bell on the door clanged in a way that made her teeth touch. She had moved back to Harrow Elm because the city felt too loud and too precise. The last place she'd kept had a stairwell that yelled every time a neighbor climbed it. The pipes had knocked at dawn as if asking permission to keep being pipes. Her mother had died here years before and left not money, but a small storage unit full of boxes whose taped seams would never look the same once you cut them. After her mother, Talia had kept a room in a city where traffic lights talked to each other and never needed anyone else's consent. Then after a woman who said user agreements out loud and ate standing at the counter. After a job with a supervisor who had a list for every human function, she had come home and taken the apartment behind the maple yard, where a square of grass waited for a pair of feet that did not demand it be trimmed perfect. She was folding towels in the back by the mop bucket when she caught the whisper. It was not the compressor, which she could recognize by the small cough it did before it made up its mind to work. It was not the cooler fan. It was softer, and it came in a rhythm that did not belong to motors. It sounded like someone talking into a bag, words turned to breath. She stood with the towel stretched, corners nearly meeting, and felt the room come around her like water. It would be very easy to give this a sudden meaning. She did not. She finished the fold, stacked it, and put the ribbon of receipt paper back into its mouth and thought about ordering more thermal rolls in the afternoon. The store's scanner developed a hiccup by 2, and the beeps started to vary. One item sang a short double blip. Another went silent and needed to be dragged across again, which always made customers feel judged. When the line hummed and the first heavy rain of September ran along the length of the awning outside, she found herself listening beneath everything to see if the whisper returned. She told herself she would not mention it to Berman. He would only say he never heard anything, and then the thing would become a joke without her consent. At closing, a county truck crept along Wren with its lights on, though evening still held. A man leaned from the passenger window with a stapled paper and affixed it to the telephone pole between the store and the laundromat. The paper was too far for Talia to read from the register. She could taste the shape of what it would say. They put a copy on the counter. Berman smoothed it with his palm. The words were county words: advisory, out of caution, temporary closure of the Old Vale North Tract. They asked for cooperation and respect. They said something about consultation with a university. They said report anything unusual to a number with an extension. They said this had nothing to do with drinking water. The paper used the word provisional once in a sentence that did not need it. It did not mention faces. On her way home, she pulled the truck to the side near the south brake and turned her engine off and listened to the settling clicks. Manifold muffler, the small tick of a cooling screw where a mechanic had snugged it after the last oil change. She would not get out. She was a person who no longer needed to prove anything to herself by stepping into trees when trees themselves said no. She breathed until the thought of doing something felt ordinary. The woods breathed back in the language they had always spoken. Thin air moved through the leaves. Somewhere water, not yet cold, gathered itself under moss. At home, she rinsed her mug with hose water while mosquitoes staged a diplomacy with her ankles. The mug had a hairline near the lip she avoided with her tongue when she drank. The towel felt better at night, less petulant, as if it understood that it had work to do. She set the mug on the counter. The fridge hummed in the lower way. She stood in the small square of her kitchen and waited for the whisper, the way a child waits for a sound he has decided is his alone. It did not come. She slept propped on 2 pillows because the angle kept a pressure off something in her head she was too careful to name. A week made a shape around the rumor. The woods stayed closed, but not with ribbons and fuss. The county wanted this to be quieter than it was. People did what they did when a collective limit is placed on them. They pretended they had never wanted the thing they were told they could not have, and then held meetings after supper to discuss ways around it. Berman taped a second sign to the door that said, "Please do not ask our staff about the trail," and then rephrased it to something nicer after a woman he liked frowned at him. The library set out a stack of field guides. A man with a good coat promised to go out and bring back evidence that this was all stories made by teenagers. Talia worked the early shift and heard the scanner beep in minor key when it reached over the wet produce. The beeps mapped the day like someone marking time under a desk with a shoe. She did not like how good it felt when a sound matched something in her head. She ate half a sandwich and tucked the rest away again. She folded the towel and thought for the 3rd day about buying a new one, and then talked herself out of it, because this towel still did the job, and she did not need to buy herself comfort, as if comfort were a treat for behaving. The second anomaly was not audible. It appeared at the edge of her landline phone when she went to call her aunt in Clearfield on Wednesday night. The phone had a hairline crack along the lower corner from a fall a year ago, and she had never replaced it because the crack was harmless, and replacing harmless things encouraged carelessness. The line had extended a hair, and where the plastic had stretched, the pattern underneath, some mottled print meant to look like stone, had aligned into what her brain tried to count as eyes. When she touched the crack with her thumbnail, the line jumped invisible to skin, but visible to the idea of a line inside her. She took her thumb away and laughed because this was the stupid kind of superstition she had left behind at 19. The laugh sounded too bright in her kitchen. The fridge hummed in the higher voice and made the room feel thin. At the store, a woman with grey hair the color of soft rope had a story. Her youngest had crept closer to the posted gate near the North Tract and claimed she heard a voice telling her to drink. The woman swatted at the air. "I said it was the river. I said, we live by wet. It's always saying come close." She put down a loaf of bread and 2 lemons and apologized to the bread for squeezing it. "You ever hear that?" she asked, eyes trying to catch something in Talia's face. "The river always says it," Talia said. She could smell the lemons over the cooler's cold breath. She envied the simplicity of a life spent saying no to children and yes to husbands. She had tried both words in equal measure and found both disappointing. She bagged the bread gently as if it were a sleeping thing. That night, she dreamed of receipts hanging like prayer flags between trees, their printed grain catching a wind that never had the decency to settle. In the morning, She found a strip of register paper on her kitchen table and did not remember bringing it home. The wood-like lines ran down its length only where the paper had been damp. She touched the mug ring near one end with her finger. The heat of her hand teased up the pale letters. A total, a date, a line break that could have been a scar. She thought stupidly of trees turned to pulp, and pulp turned to paper, and paper forced to remember what it had once known. Dawn pulled thin across Harrow Elm, and the traffic light walked through its colors without witness. A semi from the quarry moaned too early for comfort. Her neighbor at the back, a man who kept ladders lined like ribs against his garage, banged a door done out in cheap plywood and swore softly as if for no one's ears. Talia stood in her small yard and let the hose run for the garden because the forecast promised 2 dry days before the next stretch of rain. The stream arced in the new light. A smell like cold pennies rose from the soil. A mosquito used her forearm as a landing strip, and she nudged it away with the back of a knuckle. It had already made red. She heard it then, not a whisper. A kind of sibilance woven of leaves. If she had been in another head, she would have called it voices. Inside her own, it was air tasked with carrying something heavy it had not been built to hold. The sound seemed to rise from the old vale, like heat off a field. She watched the water make small trenches and told herself, wind. Wind isn't a word, so much as a permission. She turned the spigot. The gasket squealed. The stream pinched itself smaller and died. In the afternoon, Dr. Luzarledge from the county council stood near the back wall at Finch & Sons and spoke carefully, a stack of new advisories in hand. Luce was the kind of person who had learned to say nothing while appearing to say something. "We're asking folks to avoid the north and central tracts," she said. Her voice stopped up with official caution. "The lab is looking at a possible infection in the cambium layer of several species. We don't want anyone bringing anything home on boots or clothing. It's not about hysteria." She looked at the nozzle on the mop sink and smiled at it, as if smiling ever convinced any object to get easier. "It's just smart." "What kind of infection?" Berman asked. He was the sort who wanted a name, not to fight it, but to own it a little bit. People he knew were all like this. Luz read from the paper to avoid the appearance of speaking off the cuff. Preliminary results show anomalies in sample lignin structure and a disruption in ring formation consistent with an environmental stressor. We're consulting with a university team in Abriez to evaluate further. She lowered the paper and rested her palm on the counter. "Listen, it might be ordinary. We'd rather not have the kids in there for a bit. And don't drink from surface water for now." "Folks don't," Berman said, as if the idea were too quaint to survive sunlight. "Not since '89. "Good," Luz said. "Keep it that way a week." The word ring sounded inside Talia longer than it should have. She pictured smooth circles cut into cross-sections, tidy as a teacher's drawing. The memory that followed was not tidy. She was 5, being taught to count years by a man who called himself her father without ringing true and who could never say how long he would stay. He had pointed and said this was a drought, and because the gap looked thin and sick, she had believed him. He had been drinking then, just beer. And when he breathed, the air in the garage had smelled like hops and old cloth. She had put her hand on the wood disc and found it warmer than she expected, as if the tree had just been cut and not months ago. "It keeps it all right here," he had said. "You can pretend it's all gone, but wood is a mouth that never closes." He had not stayed. The circle of that time had never quite been a circle for her. She slept that night for 3 hours in a row. When she woke, she had the kind of pain that isn't T-pain so much as pressure from the inside against a door for which you do not have a key. She sat up slowly and waited for her heart to believe her first breath had done its job. Her kitchen clock defaulted to 12 says because the power had dipped for a blink while she slept. The fridge cycled up. The hum comforted and irritated in the same measure. She turned her mug by its chipped rim and noticed the chip had widened a hair. She put her thumb in the old groove and felt it catch the skin the way a door catches the cuff of a sweater. The face in the tree appeared to someone else. It was Inez Klee who saw it, a woman who worked the day shift at the laundromat and took long walks before her supper because the noise of the day shook loose only on foot. She cut behind the old bus stop where the quick path circled the minutes from Maine to Wren. What she saw, she told nobody for 3 hours. She came into the store while Talia was mopping and asked for a pack of gum and nothing else, though the trolley had a gap where bread ought to have been. "I saw," she said, and then on second thought didn't. "My hearing's been weird," she said instead. "I'm blaming the dryer. It clicks like a throat." By nightfall, she'd told the deputy. By midnight, she'd told 4 neighbors and her sister 2 towns over. By morning, it was a truth preserved in retelling. A tree the width of a car by the iron bridge. A twist of bark that looked like a mouth you knew. It had eyes, always eyes. The detail that people held the closest wasn't the look of the face and whether it matched any one person. It was that the bark seemed to have been worked from the inside by someone insisting on exiting the way a person pushes against a shirt that sticks the fibers resisting until they don't. The printed advisory grew another page. The notice Berman taped to the door at Finch & Sons said, "Trail closed" in larger letters. The Bank East S outdoor sign froze on 8.8 for hours, before remembering the shape of 1042. The way a town fills with talk is by its own rules. Old men in ball caps wore concern as a way to sharpen their tone. Teenagers made videos on their phones and posted them. Mothers frowned without much change to their routined hands. A boy with a black closet and a love of old records claimed he had recorded the whisper. He brought the recording to the store, and Berman queued it up over the ceiling speakers after hours, while he counted the drawer with the ease of a man doing the same task for 20 years. The sound came tinny, like water through a straw, and the men found it easy to discount while they kept half an ear. Later, walking to her truck, Talia recognized the same thin rope of sound hanging low over the river and did not discount it at all, though she would not admit this to anyone, not even to her own hand when it reached to shut her door a little harder. On Saturday night, the power failed for 20 minutes on a stretch from Maine to the edge of town. The sirens kept their distance, wailing somewhere near the highway where all emergencies, large and small, felt equally necessary. The groceries coolers stalled mid-breath and then restarted, compressors thunking like doors that had been kicked under stress. The laundromat's patrons waited in the parking lot, a ring of lit screens around them like a pond of digital fireflies. Talia sat on her front step and kept a hand on the mug beside her so it would not be tipped by the cat she had not agreed to own. When the lights fluttered back through the town, she heard applause from a porch on Wren and laughed to think of someone clapping for this small mercy. She took one drink of hose water because the faucet spit at first, and she hated hate in small forms. She would not have gone to the forest then, if not for the dream. In it, she stood inside a hollow where all the receipts she had ever crumpled bloomed like leaves. Each paper held a number that did not correspond to dollars. The numbers laid out a kind of map when she moved, a route through a place she did not know. She woke with the sensation of having already walked. Her pillow was damp under her neck. Her mouth felt sweet and raw, as if she'd eaten a candy she did not remember wanting. The window held a square of light from the street. She got up without thinking and without not thinking and put on the jacket she used for yard work. At the break in the fence, the air felt like a hand. Far in the black, something made a chip-chip that had always been a bird and would remain a bird after this was past. The ground under her boots was soft and surrendered. A night animal moving somewhere to her left did not mind enough to stop. She walked until the town sounds thinned to a shawl laid over a shoulder that would always prefer a coat. The iron bridge sat dark over the water. She stood not on it, but near, where the bank softened into a place someone had used for a while to sit, and then had stopped using at a time that would remain easy to lie about. She saw the tree not as a discovery, but as if it had arranged itself for her, and then waited for an appointment. It was not larger than other trees. It was not smaller. It was the size of what the mind makes when the mind chooses this tree from other trees that would have done. The bark had a twist to it that read as intention. Lines carved by weather and time gathered themselves into ridges that resembled cheek and brow. She disliked the word grotesque because it asked her to stand behind a camera she did not own, but if anyone laid the word on the bark, she would not have argued. She stepped close enough to smell the wet wood, which was like the smell from a cupboard under a sink, where water had once broken through and then been shamed back. Her hand lifted a little. She did not intend that, and yet she did not stop it. When she set her palm to the bark, she did it gently, because she had learned that you do not claim a thing by grabbing it. The surface pushed back against her in a way that did not feel dead. She recognized with unsteady gratitude a sense of being calibrated by the tree, as a new piece is grounded when you set it against the old. She was surprised to be comforted. She was not surprised at all to find the comfort make room for something else. The pressure found her behind her right eye and pressed. It was not pain in the usual register. It was like the feeling of being watched by a face you cannot see. It sat like an egg in the nest of bone and sent small, exact changes through her. Her throat tightened, the way a throat tightens against tears when you do not have time for tears. And yet the body insists on the argument. She kept her hand where it was. She moved the heel of her palm a fraction and felt the sensation change the way a sound changes when your ear tilts. She said out loud, "Okay," because words help the body know which way to lean. In that small Boy Scout flashlight slice of night she had brought to the base of the trunk, she saw the bark at her hand's edge. What another person might describe as a mouth suggested itself in the way two long fissures cut before meeting. It had no tongue. It had the shape of someone in the act of not screaming. Her own face had stuck like that once 10 years ago, when she was told on a cheap phone in the back of a bar that her mother had been taken to a hospital 2 towns over and wouldn't want Talia to see how she looked. She pulled her hand back. She felt the place where palm met bark for a long second after she stopped touching it. She closed her fingers into a fist and let them know this had been enough for now. On the walk back to Wren, the traffic light at Main held red for an empty road. The world behaved as if unimpressed. She passed the laundromat and the dryer with the click was still clicking, a nickel trapped where it shouldn't be. She listened until the clicks matched and then fell out of step with the beat in her head, and in the gap, emotions rushed in. Sorrow, less for anything in particular than for the clear way forward. She slept with the towel over her face like a second pillow. News of Inez Klee's disappearance reached the store by opening. The deputy stood with his hat in his hands near the plastic rack of funny cards and failed to look calm. "We're asking folks to stay home after dark," he said. He did not say, "A woman took a walk and did not come back." He did not say, "Her sister waited until midnight and went looking and found only the iron bridge and her own breath." He did not say, "We know plenty of reasons women do not come back, but the river is low this week and none of those apply." He pinned a paper to the cork near the time clock. The paper was only 3 syllables long, curfew. He gave it hours and then took up his hat again with a tenderness that made Talia want to look away. At noon, the professor arrived. His name was Merrin Pell, and he had the kind of jacket that held itself up without the help of the person inside. He ordered a coffee and paid cash, and didn't take his change. He left his card on the counter, as if he had dropped by to replace a window. The card said dendrology in a font that did not match the jacket and a university that sounded farther away than it was. Berman trapped him with questions while pretending to look bored. "Does it make sense," he asked, "that a tree would look like a person to someone who's scared?" Pell's voice did what university voices do in rooms with humming lights. It softened to avoid the echo. "Look, patterns are a function of the brain," he said. "We imprint faces, animal shapes, stories. It's not about a tree wanting to be a person. It's about our pattern-hungry minds wanting to settle." He considered the tip jar and failed to put money in it. "That said," he added, the qualifier he had brought all this way, "we have found anomalies." Lignin laid down in inconsistent fashion, a cambial layer like lint, a sort of felted mat. "I've not seen this exact thing. It's not a pathogen as we recognize pathogens. It may be environmental, some combination of stressors and a curse," said the boy with the phone sweetly. Pell did not bother to smile. "We try not to use that kind of language," he said, because he had been trained to make sure words do not cause fires. "But people who feel excluded from our language will find their own, and language behaves like mold." "So you're saying," Berman said, wanting a plank to walk, "it's in the wood?" "I'm saying something is happening in the wood that's not happening everywhere else, and we are not prepared to say what it means for anybody's health." Pell looked at Talia then, as if he could hear her thinking. She looked down. She didn't like being made into a question without warning. That afternoon, she was sent to the back to count bleach and paper towels. The freight door stuck in the heat and then lurched with the tiny violence it kept for bad days. The concrete back there kept cool, no matter what the sun did. The flake of paint that had fallen last winter was still on the margin where wall meets floor, a small anti-country. She stacked cases and used her thigh to push them straight. When she stood, the price gun fell from a shelf and hit the ground with an unripe thud. She picked it up and squeezed the trigger against her palm just to see how it felt. The mechanism bit a little. The sting traveled down bone and found the nest behind her eye and set it quivering. She drove home the long way so she would not pass the iron bridge. She took the main loop and went by the houses that sat with wide porches like mouths ready to talk. A siren went out from the direction of the highway again and stayed out, a ribbon laid on air. Then someone clipped it in the middle and the leftover ends curled. She stopped at the light with everyone else and watched a man push a stroller over the crosswalk with his shoulder muscles tight and his eyes set straight ahead like he was taking a test. The light turned green before he reached the other side. Nobody honked for once. She watched until he made it. After supper, she took the receipts from her pocket. She laid them soft, somewhere between a file and a nest. The longest had the faint wood grain she'd seen and not seen all week. She smoothed it and held it to the window. And the thin evening made whatever was hiding inside the paper surface the way a story appears when you tell it to someone else, and then you hear it true for the first time. The grain took on the shape of a mouth. She laughed at herself, then didn't. The mouth had an upward pull at the corners, the exact geometry of an apology. She put the paper under the mug to hide it because she didn't trust what looking at it would do to her. When she took the mug away later, a ring remained, 2 shades darker than the rest. Her fridge hummed the high note again, then dropped to the low one like a pitcher who finds the strike zone and stays there. She slept and did not sleep. The curfew made night feel borrowed and easily revoked. She tasted iron at the back of her throat as if old coins had dissolved there. She woke at one with the clear idea that something had tapped the glass. The window was still. The streetlight was 1 square. The cat rubbed itself against her ankle and she let it. Sorry to have to say later that she'd allowed something to use her as an object. On Sunday, the town held a meeting at the church because the church had the only room with chairs that weren't borrowed from somewhere else. The pastor opened with a prayer that never said the words it needed, and said many others that wrapped around them like ivy. Pell stood to one side with a cup of water he did not drink and waited for someone to ask the question he wanted to answer. Talia sat in the back, near a fan that turned in a lazy Australian motion, and the pattern of its blades claimed part of her attention the way a worthless story can keep a child quiet. People stood and didn't speak when they thought they were speaking. Questions cut the air. If it's not the water, why does the water smell like old pennies? If it's not in the air, why does the air feel like cold honey? If it's not a curse, why do I see my mother in the maple across from the school? If it's a curse, whose is it? The last one came from the back, offered in a tone that made no one a target. Luzarlich cleared her throat. We will keep monitoring. Please give us your cooperation. Please stay away from the old veil. Please don't, even to look. By not saying even to look, she had to say it. Talia thought, we do not know what to do when a thing is in the material we own. She stopped by the laundromat on her way home and stood by the dryer that clicked. The clicking had no pattern until she wanted it to. The owner sat under the no dies sign and read a paper that had an old baseball player on the front. The same player it had had for days because the owner liked that face. Talia put her quarters in out of habit, then remembered the towel was fine. She took them back out and felt the tiny weight of the coin iron itself into the web of her hand. What others put together as a curse, she assembled as a series of useful facts. Wood carries memory. Paper is wood after it has been made forget. The brain fits faces to random. Stress knits flesh to odd. Time corrodes pattern and calls corrosion something else in the dark. She understood that her understanding did not exempt her. She found herself washing the mug more carefully, avoiding the chip, and then forgetting to avoid it and scraping her lip on its sharpness that had moved closer to the rim. She wrapped the towel a different way from habit and let it dry along the cooler S-grate, which left a pattern on the cloth like lines on a palm. She stood at the traffic light at Main and Wren and stared at the red circle until it seemed to move in depth. And when it changed to green, she knew it not as permission, but as resignation. The day Inez Klee was found had weather too good to be believed. It made color out of everything, and then it hung it up like ideas in a classroom. Harrow Elm had a fire station whose equipment was older than the men and women who touched it, and when the trucks returned from something small, people stood on porches to watch the way they lifted the door as if trucks could bless. The deputy who'd posted the curfew drove by slowly in the hours before dusk and stopped to speak in the cautious way of someone who wanted the conversation to end before it began. They found her, he said in the door of Finch & Sons, up near the Iron Bridge. It looks like, then stopped, because he would not in his life be the man who made the first stupid myth true. Who went up there? Berman asked. He made his voice sound like someone who might later say he'd told them not to. Pell, the deputy said, with an apology as if Pell had been a dog that ran to chew a bone you had thrown. Of course, Berman said. Did he recognize what he was looking at? Don't say it that way, the deputy said. He put his hand to his eye the way people do when a headache finds its chair. It's her. She's there, she's in it. Not in the way a person goes into water and finds bottom. In the way a person pressed hard enough leaves a shape. Her face. He swallowed, and the words he didn't say to follow Inez. As name, Don T go up there, Don T look, pushed the first ones out of his mouth like the end of a toothpaste tube you were trying to finish. He added, please, don't go. If you notice anything, call loose. Don't post. Don't be stupid. The store grew quiet after that, as if people had stepped out for a smoke and could be trusted to come back. The scanner beeped half-heartedly and fell into silences that lasted long enough for Talia to remember times when she had chosen silence to punish someone who couldn't to take a hint. She bagged and wiped and made sure her nails did not tap on the counter when she stood still. She did not go to the tree. She believed herself when she said she did not need to see it. She believed herself when she said that the face of a woman she had begged for and used to borrow detergent from when she ran short was none of her business now. Yet the tree did not honor her tidy rules. That night, the whisper rose from the woods with the same inevitability the fridge made when it returned to its low hum. She put a cushion on the floor by the back door and sat with her head leaned against the wood of the frame. The whisper found the bones around her ear and set up its small, methodical camp. She breathed and felt ridiculous and did not move. The next day, the county closed not just the north and central, but the south track too. They printed a paper in bigger letters and used the word ordnance. They put up sawhorses at the trailheads and tied tape that shook itself loose from branches by afternoon. The town made new noise in place of the quiet the woods had offered. A woman broke into tears by the baking aisle. And when Talia asked if she could help, the woman said, "I can't find the recipe card for my mother's cake," and then laughed because she heard herself and thought she hadn't told the truth. A teenage boy pointed at the stack of paper towels and said to his friend that wood is in everything, man. And the friend smirked and then looked awkward because this was not the time to be seeing too much. At night, the stairwell into Talia's apartment began speaking. The boards had always creaked because boards do, but the creaks took on punctuation they had previously lacked. The third step from the top complained like a person disturbed from sleep. The sixth had a way of flexing that made the pitch drop and then jump a note. She caught herself stepping to avoid the step that sounded like a mouth beginning to form a word. She hated how fast a body can learn fear when the fear is as simple as dawn to go there. She forced herself to use the noisy step in the morning because it felt like letting a bully win if she didn't tee. She held the handle and placed her heel and listened, and then it was done, and the only difficult part had been the waiting. The rest of the day she felt taller in her own skull. She saw the root when she stepped into the yard to check the hose. It had surfaced overnight along the fence line the way cables do after a storm pushes them. It ran like a vein from under the neighbor's yews to her box of pale chrysanthemums. It wasn't thick, not the storybook kind that displaces stones, but something young and intent. She squatted and placed a finger on it and felt no particular give. It accepted the touch without complaint. When she pressed her ear to the earth, she felt ridiculous for an instant, and then, beneath her ridiculousness, felt something tapping slower than a heartbeat and uncommitted. The tapping was so light she had to tell herself she felt it. She lifted her head, and the tap rose to her skull, where pressure had already found a home. She stood and decided the root had nothing to do with anything. She went inside and washed her hands 3 times out of habit rather than fear, and laughed when she realized what she had done. By Wednesday, the deputy had a new habit of driving along Wren at slow intervals, window down, though the air was like cloth in the mouth. He did not look at anyone directly because if you did, it made people wave, and he had never learned how to wave as a deputy without looking smug. He took a left by the school, stopped by the tape at the southern break and idled, engine making a steady, small growl that kept animals at a distance. He stood in a way that said politely that he preferred a different life, and Talia wondered what voice had found him in the hours God gives to men who cannot sleep. Talia took a towel to the dryer and gave the laundry quarters. The machine rattled coins at her in return. While it ran, she watched her own satisfaction at the sound of a load moving toward dry. She watched the faces people make when they think no one is looking, how the mouth goes slack and the eyes become noun-like. She thought about Inez Klee and how it would feel to see something that did not respect your idea of your shape. She thought about laying your face against bark and what that would do to wood that had been taught by weather already to do without help. She took the towel out when it was still a little damp and told herself it would dry fully on the chair back and that she preferred this. She forgot to buy detergent and had to go back the next morning. Her body went through the motion without much of her help, and it felt nice to be so easily led. The professor came back through Finch and Sons and bought more coffee. His jacket had lost a little of its fight, but he kept himself precise in other ways, as if applying exactness to something will force it to behave. "We knew wood recorded stress," he said to the air. "You can see it in ring density, in late wood thickness, but the samples from the old Vale, these aren't just records. Something is being written, yes, but not in the language the tree was taught. There are compounds in the sap we don't have labels for. I'm not eager to invent one." He looked at Talia in a way that made her suspect he chose her because he saw she would not answer. "The talk about souls. I do not want to be a man who stands in a place like this and uses the word soul, but there is a kind of insistence, a recruitment of matter, not like a fungus, no, a fungal mat behaves differently. This is..." He corrected himself before he said intention, which would get him in trouble with both colleagues and clergy. "This is a pattern that grows when you look. It asks you to find it." He looked away, embarrassed by how much he had said aloud. "That's what faces are," she said, surprising herself with sound. "Patterns that grow when you look." He smiled then, because he had been given a sentence he could agree with without handing away his training. "Yes," he said, "faces are opportunists." "You went up there," she said. "Simple." He nodded. "I shouldn't have." "Then why?" He did not answer. He looked at the receipt spool and traced the edge of the paper with a thumb, and Talia saw the grain rise under the friction. He left the coffee where he stood and touched the bell on the door with his shoulder as he left. The text from her aunt came after supper, the way her aunt always saved difficult messages for when the day had worn Talia down enough to accept them. "You could come to Clearfield for a week," it read. "We've got the spare made up, it's quieter." Talia stood by her sink with the towel in her hands and thought of the spare room S window that looked at an alley. She thought of the fan there that clicked once per rotation and the old carpet that made her shins itch. She thought of the silence she had carried back with her to Harrow Elm when she last returned, a silence that had weighed the same as any other kind but had belonged to no tree. She wrote, "Thank you," and left the feeling in her chest unanswered. The receipt paper began popping its grain, whether or not she touched it. Customers noticed and then chose not to see. The bank sign made a number wrong again. The light stuck on red for almost a full minute one morning, when the road held only a truck carrying rolled fencing and a runner who stood with both hands on her hips and used the paws to stretch her calves one at a time, the way you do when you've decided to take instruction from your legs. The rumor about Inez's face softened into a story familiar enough to tell on front steps, and Talia thought that the story's edges were not getting blunter, but had been removed altogether, leaving only the feel of a shape without the worry of evidence. She did not go to the tree again. The pressure behind her eye had become a pet she had not wanted. It followed her room to room, lay down in the spaces she had taught herself were safest, rose when she rose. Some mornings it brightened as soon as she lifted her head from the pillow, a reply to a question she had decided not to ask. If she stayed very still, she could coax it to settle lower and turn soft without leaving. Her appetite became a narrow canal in which small boats could pass. She ate oatmeal because it took little chewing, and because the mug did not like soup. She drank water from the hose in the evening, when the air was the temperature of the inside of a hand. Ordinary things grew unsettling the way a familiar path grows unsettling when a new fence appears at its edge. She found a knot in her cutting board that, once seen as an eye, returned to its knotness only after an argument. The stair's complaint made a phrase she refused to translate. The fridge's low hum and the compressor's middle cough, a synergy that had never sounded like anything, now seemed to call and answer. The barcode beeps lay along the day like stitches made by a hand that had taken a class. She began to choose her shoes by the sound they made on concrete. She stopped listening to music because a song written by someone else gave the pressure in her head a measure, and it wanted its own. Harrow Elm, which had the capacity to ignore nearly anything on purpose, began to adjust. The curfew held with the stubbornness people use when the state's voice lines up with something they already half believed. The church offered 2 nights of prayer. On the second, fewer people came, and the third night was not proposed. The teenagers took photographs from the road and turned their cameras away when a deputy stood near. A rumor moved that the old Vale had been cursed by an old wrong that never got corrected. Another moved that the university had discovered a pathogen and would not say because lawsuits. The county printed another paper about cooperation. The papers kept the story the way potato sacks keep potatoes when carried by men with bad backs, carefully, with frequent breaths. None of it mattered when it was just Talia and her kitchen and the towel folded into a soft rectangle and the paper under her mug saved for reasons she did not articulate. One morning before dawn, the whisper thickened. It was like the difference between steam on a mirror and breath on glass. It clung. She stood in the yard under a sky that could not make up its mind between black and first blue. The route along the fence had become 3, thinner than cords but visible, and all of them seemed to angle toward her rather than away. She had thought of the whisper as something the air did when passing through trees. Now it seemed to be coming from the ground. She knelt and put her palm flat. The earth was damp from night and cool. She closed her eyes and felt the tap, precise as a metronome in a room with a closed door. When she lifted her hand, the sound did not lessen. It moved with her, inside her skull where doors were not built to close. And she knew, calmly, in the unglamorous way one knows a bus is late, that it would not go. She went to work because work is a way to make the mind behave. She noticed the scanner skipping on one barcode and drew a pen through the label and wrote the number by hand on the register slip, her old-fashioned fix for a problem that had nothing to do with numbers. She folded the towel at closing more neatly than it needed and set it on the edge of the sink. She felt the pressure, like something that wanted a shape from her and did not care which. She thought about the words for what it might be: obsession, anxiety, headache. She discarded each for being too proud or too dramatic or simply lazy. She accepted instead that there are times the world insists on running a line through you, and you can stand very still and hope the line passes without leaving a mark. The mark, when it came, did not appear on her skin. It appeared in the paper. She had been saving the slips without planning to because some part of her wanted to prove she'd been here in case she wasn't tea anymore. She unrolled one of the long ones with half the store on it, and laid it on the table and got her head close. The wood grain lines that had visited and left on other days now stayed. A faint pattern that ran from corner to corner. If she stared long enough, the grain reshaped itself into something that did not need her to make it a face. The raised parts, where heat had touched, where the roll had been pinched, stood like bones under skin. She got close enough to feel her breath bounce and warm her mouth. The lines arranged themselves around a mouth she knew. It took her a minute to place it. It wasn't Inez's, it wasn't her aunt's, it was her mother's, or rather, the memory of her mother turning from a stove to say, "Wait," soft, because you never tell a child wait in a loud voice, or she will refuse the word forever. She moved the mug across the face and watched it go rainy through ceramic. She took the mug away and the face held. She put her hand on the paper and felt a heat that couldn't be from her palm. She thought, with a clarity that made her hear her own blood, that the wood had taught itself to make faces out of fibers and found its way through machines and into her house by way of receipts and towels and the stairs and every processed thing that carried tree inside. She sat back and let her shoulder blades find the hard chair, and did not use the words soul or curse, because those words would not help her perform the action that came next. She lifted the slip by one corner and moved it to the fridge, and magneted it to the door under the shift schedule, and left it there like a particularly indecent sketch. The pressure behind her eye rewarded her. It loosened a notch. She could breathe without feeling like breath was a bargain. She washed the mug because it needed washing. She turned the towel because that part of the towel was still damp. She stood in the doorway between kitchen and stairs and did not have to count to 10 before climbing. The fridge purred along in its lower voice, pleased the way a dog might be pleased to be allowed to thrive under your hands. When she woke, the face had changed. She should have known it would. The paper was only as steady as heat and humidity allowed. The mouth was different. It smiled a little in a way that was never pleasing. Under the eyes, tiny lines had appeared that had not been printed. She returned the face to the table because she could not think of the refrigerator bearing it all day like a billboard. She set the mug on top. She went to work. It felt like the town had been holding its breath all week and now exhaled into action, because action lets people know they are alive. A man in a high-visibility vest stood by the closed entrance to the old Vale, with a radio at his shoulder, and looked as if he had been told to watch a pot that boiled anyway. A woman arrived with a clipboard and signed in men who lacked better tasks and wanted to feel they were guarding something that could be guarded. Luce Arledge spoke into a camera at the square, while the anchor for Channel 6 held her microphone near a mouth that did not look interested. Pell walked along Wren and did not look up at windows because he had done enough looking. The deputy drank coffee from a paper cup and did not bother to pretend he knew what to do if the whisper became a sound people could not ignore. The teenagers filmed themselves not filming the woods. The bank sign got the time almost right. At closing, Berman set a roll of before-date bread by the back and put a knife next to it, with the implicit permission he always gave Talia to take what she wanted from the day. She cut a slice and ate it without butter, and found she had to pause to make her mouth send it in the direction it was meant to go. She felt, suddenly, a wave of sweetness in the lower part of her throat, and had to hold the edge of the table to keep from leaning her whole body in its direction. She swallowed. Her eyes watered. The scanner beeped as if calling a dog. She went home and sat with the receipt again. She did not do anything with it at first. She let it sit on the thick wood of the kitchen table her mother had kept too long. The table smelled faintly of the polish a man sold from the back of his truck. The table had its own face if you looked long enough, and the table didn't care if you saw it. She put the receipt next to one of the table's knots, and the two eyes together made a face she could love, if she did not request it, to love her back. She leaned down and pressed the side of her head to the tabletop and offered her skull to its grain like a hostage, given the opportunity to choose paper or rope. The pressure behind her eye aligned with a line in the wood, and the result was what she had learned to expect: relief offered by something that did not mind what it took. Her phone rang in the other room. She did not answer. A text arrived. She did not know who from. The cat brushed her ankle, and she let it because sometimes bodies need other bodies. The fridge began to hum in its higher range, and she took that as instruction to get up and adjust it, then didn't, because the small trouble seemed like a price paid to avoid the larger one. At midnight, the whisper swelled. It moved through the walls the way certain odors do, ones you cannot point to. She sat in the stairwell in the dark to listen because the stairwell was made of wood that trusted her. She ran her palm along the trim and felt, to her embarrassment and awe, a change. The grain rose under her hand where it had not. She could name the place where two boards met by feel now. She knew where the carpenter had hurried to make time, even though a piece adhering better would have cost him only a minute. She felt the place where an old nail had been pulled, and a new nail, a fraction thinner, had been driven down, with the strange shame of repeating an action that only stood up to a soft wind. She said into the dark, "I'm here," and the whisper paused, then returned as if it had moved through her and gone on. She thought then about going to the tree and placing her face. She thought only for a second, because the idea made her stomach drain and fill. She wanted something else. She wanted to be part of what was happening without having to stand in the open and let everyone who arrived to look see her being part of it. She did not want to be the woman at dawn called by her name, by people who barely remembered it. She wanted the quieter version. She wanted to be admitted where she could sit and not be asked to explain her presence. She understood this was the least generous form of cowardice and forgave herself because she knew what she could do and what she could not. In the morning, the root at the fence had sent a thinner braid under her box of chrysanthemums, and the box leaned without falling. She fixed it as if balance were not a metaphor here. She ran the hose and watched fine bubbles appear along the seam where the spigot met the wall, and the bubbles looked like a string of pearls made from air, and another word she refused to say. She stood in her small square of yard and thought about leaving, and saw clearly how nothing would change. She would carry the whisper with her the way people bring their cold into church. She looked up and saw a dead limb in the maple above. She thought that would crush me if it fell. She thought, I will move my chair. She thought it doesn't have to be a romance. Her aunt wrote a second time. "Come," the text said. "The garden there is for people. It's different. Please, Leah." Her aunt always mistook what the problem was, and that mistake loosened Talia's ribs for a minute with the love of someone who volunteers to hold a bag, not realizing there is another bag behind it. She wrote, "Soon," which was not a lie and wasn't not one. That day was the last before rain. The air carried pre-storm in it like static that shy people do better with than bold ones. The deputy stopped by the store and bought coffee that had sat too long, and because of this, his mouth was shaped in a new way when he told Berman that the county would be replacing the cedar poles along Wren first thing next week, because they had lifted at their bases and the lines were sagging, and someone complained. The man from the power company laughed a little because cedar gives like a spine when it's been in weather, and long ago taught itself to be useful, but he did not say it to the deputy because the deputy was a man who needed to have fixed something by supper time. They went back and forth in the door as the door chimed 4 times for 3 men entering. The professor delivered himself to the tree at dusk without asking permission from anyone who could say no. Talia learned this piece afterward. It folded into her day easy as any other. He had brought with him a knife he'd used for coring other trees, a bag of vials, and a careful disrespect for the rules the county had printed. He had not brought anyone who would stop him from touching what would hurt him to touch. When they found him at midnight, because he had not returned calls, and because a volunteer with the radio had seen a light bobbing where no light should obey its owner, his jacket was on the ground folded slick, his cores laid out like spent candles, and his hand, one, was in the bark up to the knuckles. Only his hand. The rest of him stood, eyes open, mouth not screaming, pressed against the trunk as if he wanted to be reassured that he had not wasted the last years of his life. In the morning, Talia read the shortest article the paper had ever run about a man who had brought knowledge with him to a place that had no use for it. The face on the bark was his and wasn't, and people said so in ways that let them off the hook for having called him to come in the first place. Rain began in a slow apology that noon and grew serious by 4. The water rolled off the awning along Wren in sheets that you could stand under and pretend you weren't getting wet if you had an errand to do that you didn't want to be judged for. The whisper thickened again, and the people who had been pretending not to hear it found an empty aisle and held their heads, not to quiet the noise so much as to comfort the skull. Berman brought coffee to the back and drank it without heat. The fluorescent developed a flicker that made everyone look wrong for a second before they remembered how to be people again. The bank sign went black and stayed black. Someone ran the yellow at Main and Wren because the light had stuck too long and because his child had been crying, and he stood later in his kitchen wrapping his arms around nothing while his wife threw bread at the sink. The tree near the iron bridge took 2 more faces that the town agreed about and 4 more that they didn't tea. Another root appeared by Talia's fence, thin as a shoelace, and on its way to being something else. She watched water drop from the corner of the garage roof and make a small lake stamped with circles that found each other and combined and surrendered. She moved the box with chrysanthemums again for the sake of doing a thing she could do. She set her mug on the rail and it tipped in a way it had not when the rail was new. She caught it, chipped rim against thumb, and felt a little bit of blood appear as if she'd tuned in a station that wasn't meant for her. She put her mouth to the place and found it tasted more like the hose than memory. She sat and put the towel on the porch step and looked at nothing without admitting how long she could keep it up. She could have left. People did. 1 car a day after the rain began carried something like a family, and something like their future, and something like their shame. She did not leave because her limiting resource had become the thing that had no name in any language the town used. She washed the mug and set it on the rack. She looked at the receipt on the table and found the face had smoothed into anonymous grain again, as if heat and water had reminded it of its simpler life. She felt a grief for that which was disproportionate and then did not punish herself by pointing that out. The whisper grew a length to it, as if someone were telling a story in a language you know only by rhythm. People said you could pretend for a little while that it was the rain itself. People said any sound becomes a story when it repeats. People said the paycheck from the county would help. People said in the aisles that the wood was hungry, and men stood in the door pretending the word hungry had nothing to do with them, so they could laugh. Talia folded the towel and lay down on the couch and put the towel over her eyes and found a darkness that would hold the shape of her skull. In the days that followed, the town behaved like places do when a slow trouble asks you to become something else. They rearranged. They changed the open signs hours by 12 minutes. They added a message to the bottom of the receipt that said, "Take care," in the script of someone who learned to write from a mother who liked cards. They kept doors closed. They met each other again in the store because the store made a model of order that even the whisper recognized as necessary. The tree near the iron bridge developed a poor reputation and then a formal one. The deputy learned to ask men to lower their voices without flattening them. Luce Arledge slept in her office every other night on a blue foam pad that remembers where it was wound. Pellier's colleagues printed a letter and folded it into the town's idea of a record and sent someone else who did not put his hand in. Talia sat with her paper and her mug and her old table and the towel, and she let herself become a small and steady surface. She did not tell herself a story about heroism or quitting. She did not claim knowledge. She laid her head down once a day against the table, the way a person lays a head down on a lover's stomach and feels the lift and fall and decides this is enough today. She stared at the receipt grain and then stopped staring because staring never taught it to be kinder. The last week of September went pale at the edges. The air lost its syrup thickness. The traffic light at Main gave people the right of way without sulking. The bank sign remembered time and then kept it. The store printed 3-foot-long receipts and 4 that were comically tiny. The whisper did not stop, but it climbed a rung or 2 back into the trees and into the boards and stood there like a good coat that will not be packed away, ready to be put on. The pressure behind her eye did not leave, but learned to live beside the rest of her. She fed herself. She filled the bird feeder, though she never had before, and watched the dumb elegance of wings that have never had to speak in language. She left the face on the table, and it did not come back into the grain. And one night, late, She set her cheek on that place and whispered her own name. She didn't need the tree to answer. In time, weeks or years, depending on how a person counts, the county took away the tape and then brought part of it back, and then stopped pretending tape did anything but stain hands. People went into the woods with the reluctance of someone re-entering a room that had held a final argument. They wore boots and carried the new caution. A boy put a hand on a trunk and cried for a reason he would never be able to make funny later. A woman stood by the iron bridge and had to sit on the embankment without grace, while her husband brought her sugar in the form of candy, because that's what you do when a body threatens to leave its rules. Pell's students came and wrote words and left again, without resolving the human problem of having learned and having to live too. The faces on the tree stayed some weeks and softened and disappeared the way a bruise the size of a hand does if you don't to keep pointing at it. It left behind bark that had learned to expect touch. Talia's stairwell learned to sound like itself again, except when she was alone in it. The towel softened on its own. She bought a new mug because she felt she had earned it. And the new mug was cheap and perfect and wrong, and she chipped it by accident a week later and laughed. The fridge kept its two voices, and she decided the lower one had a nice personality. The receipts still sometimes showed grain and sometimes didn't, and she smoothed them with her palm and taped them into a book for a while, and then stopped doing that, because you cannot keep meaning in a book without the book eating your day. She kept one on the fridge, the one that had changed 3 times and then stayed plain. She used it to hold a shopping list under a magnet. At night, when the whisper was loudest, and she thought of Inez and Pell and the men in vest and the deputy and Luce and her mother and the teenage boy and the cat and the cupboard under the sink, she placed her head back and let the table offer its shape to hers and waited. As one waits for a light to change when there is no traffic either way, and yet it must, because this is how we agree the day moves. She lifted her hand and tapped once on the wood, a small courtesy to the part of her that still wanted to be counted. The tap came back, built into her bone, softer now, like the kind of thunder you can sleep through. She closed her eyes and did not ask the tree to tell her the story it tells. She went to sleep inside a house that knew wood and woke to the sound of a fridge that forgave. And when she stepped onto the stair that complained, she rested her weight there a second longer, listening to the difference between old wood and new wood, and found it all in the end, familiar enough to live inside. On a morning cold enough to make her breath show in the store's front glass, a stack of register paper arrived late. She opened the box and touched the roll, and felt beneath the smooth a faint itch, like the fur on a new coat. She laughed at herself, soft without spite, because nothing on the outside of the paper told her it remembered anything. She fed the roll through the mouth of the printer and tugged, and the paper came out, obedient, blank, ready. She set the mug down by the machine and heard the barcode beep for a jar of pickles, as if it had always been the same sound. She looked at the receipt from the morning shift, and then she didn't. A woman bought a towel. Another bought a hose. Someone paid cash. Someone wrote a check on a bank that would not outlast any of them. The traffic light at Main behaved. The bank sign kept time and down in the old vale, which was not old in any way that mattered. The trees moved like the fingers of someone who knows a song and chooses not to play it just now. When she stepped outside on her break and walked to the edge of Wren where the tape had been, the whisper lay soft across the space between trunks. Too easy to mistake for breeze until it wasn't. She stood with her hand on the rough of the telephone pole that had replaced the cedar and came away with a splinter that she did not mind. She thought, briefly, of placing her face and felt a wave come and pass, a tiny tide against the coastal organ in her head. She went back into the store and straightened the line of receipts at the register and put the towel over her shoulder, as if it had always belonged there, hours marked out by barcode beeps and the click and sigh of compressors waking and sleeping. The tree kept its secrets where secrets belong, in wood and paper, and the body's quiet. And in Harrow Elm, a person could learn to live with what was not willing to let her go, which is as much of an ending as life on most days needs.